This Karen literally chained my driveway shut and told me I was trespassing on my own family land, which, looking back, was probably the single worst decision of her entire pampered life. I'd been gone for 3 long years, working my skin to the bone on oil rigs from Texas to North Dakota, and I came home expecting to find the peace of the Colorado wilderness. But instead, I found steel chains and private community, sign blocking the mountain road my great-grandfather carved out of the rock back in 1923. But here's the thing that really blew my mind. While I was away, 8 multi-million-dollar glass and steel monstrosities had sprouted like ugly, invasive weeds in my pristine valley, and that crisp pine scent I'd been dreaming about in the frozen wasteland of the north was now being choked out by some woman's overpowering, expensive designer perfume. My name is Silas Vance. Most people just call me C, and at 48 years old, I got hands that are permanently stained with the grease of the rigs and a back that groans every time I get out of my truck. But this land was my legacy, the only thing I had left after my mom passed away from Alzheimer's and Oppos. As 6 months ago, I'd spent every dime I made sending checks to the best memory care facility in Denver, watching her slowly forget my name while I breathed in the smell of petroleum and dust. So when I finally settled her affairs, I just wanted to come home to the cabin and remember how to be human again. But standing there by the chain was a woman who looked like she'd stepped straight out of a Dallas real estate catalog. Blonde bob sharp enough to draw blood. A clipboard held like a weapon, and an attitude that screamed she'd never worked a day of real labor in her entire manicured life. Her name was Victoria Sterling, the self-appointed queen of the Ridgeview Estate HOA, And as she climbed out of her white Range Rover, she looked at my rusted-out F-250 like it was a pile of radioactive waste. Well, the hermit returns, she said, her smile so fake it could have frozen lava, But you and Oppos, re-trespassing on private property, and we don in Oppos, to allow unauthorized vehicles beyond this point. I kept my voice dead calm, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs, and I told her mind Oppos, that in Oppos. That's my cabin up there. My family has lived in this valley since the 20s, But she just tapped her clipboard and said, not anymore at ISN and Oppos. And you and Oppos, already facing $30,000 in back fines for non-compliance, What this HOA queen didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have guessed, was that I didn't in Oppos. T just owned that century-old cabin at the end of the road. I owned the mineral rights under every single one of her precious mansions. And in the state of Colorado, mineral rights are like a legal sledgehammer that can level an entire mountain of bureaucracy if you know how to swing it. She handed me a manila envelope thicker than a phone book, filled with 47 separate violation notices. My roof color didn't in Oppos. T matched there architectural palette my 1930s root cellar was an unauthorized outbuilding and the wildflowers my grandmother had planted were non-compliant landscaping The total was nearly $75,000, and she gave me 30 days to pay up or face foreclosure on a property my family owned before her parents were even. A glimmer in someone into Oppos. That evening, I sat in my cabin by the light of a kerosene lamp, because Victoria had already called the power company claiming emergency electrical hazards to get my lines cut, and I felt a cold, hard anger settling in my chest. I've lived through North Dakota winters and oil rig blowouts, so a woman with a clipboard wasn't into Oppos. She gonna break me, but I knew I had to play this smart. The next morning, I drove down to the county courthouse and met Jolene, a clerk who'd been there since the Carter administration. And when I asked about the HOA filings, her face went from friendly to funeral director serious. She told me the Ridgeview HOA had been rushed through the approval process about 18 months ago, but then she dropped the first piece of the puzzle. My signature was and Oppos. On a single document. In Colorado, an HOA needs unanimous consent to bind every property in a specific area. And since I was away and never signed a thing, Victoria Sterling was essentially playing house with authority she didn't and Oppos legally have. But I didn't and Oppos just want to stop her. I wanted to know who I was dealing with, so I spent the next week playing the part of the defeated hermit while I installed 6 high-end trail cameras with night vision and audio recording all around my perimeter. Colorado is a one-party consent state, and this was my land, so every word they spoke on my property was mine to keep. Within 48 hours, I struck absolute gold. I caught Victoria and 2 of her, architectural committee, goons creeping around my porch at dawn like discount ninjas, taking photos and laughing about how they were going to, pressure the old man out, so they could buy the lot for a song and put up a clubhouse. Victoria's voice came through my speakers as clear as a bell, saying, if the fines Don and Oppos, T work, we and Oppos, LL file a false environmental report about his septic tank, the county will condemn the place in a week, I felt my jaw clench as I watched the footage, but I remembered what you learn on the rigs. If you rush a job with heavy equipment, someone gets killed, so you have to think 3 moves ahead. Right on schedule, a guy from the county health department named Miller showed up, looking embarrassed because he'd known my grandfather and said he'd received anonymous tips about, groundwater contamination, I didn't oppose, T argue. I invited him in, gave him a cup of coffee, and told him to test everything. While he was working, I handed him a USB drive with the footage of Victoria planning the false report. Miller's face went pale as he watched it, and he just shook his head, saying, Silas, your system is cleaner than the ones in those mansions, and what she and Oppos is doing here, that and Oppos is a felony. I let the pressure build, watching through my binoculars as Victoria held, emergency meetings, on her manicured lawn, probably planning her next move, while I was busy doing some deep dive research at the library. That's when I found the, nuclear option, my great-grandfather wasn't an Oppos, just a homesteader. He was a prospector who'd filed a federal patent that granted him the surface rights to 320 acres and the subsurface mineral rights to nearly 1,500 acres covering the entire valley floor. When my family sold off the smaller parcels in the 80s, they only sold the surface, the mineral rights, the water rights, and something called, perpetual access easements, stayed with the original cabin lot. I took all this to a property rights attorney in the city named Elias Thorne, a man who looked like he ate HOA presidents for breakfast, and when he saw my documents, he actually whistled. He told me that under federal mining laws dating back to the 1800s, mineral rights are the, dominant estate, meaning I had the legal right to disturb the surface of any of those multi-million-dollar lots if I decided I wanted to look for ore. But more importantly, every single building permit Victoria had secured was technically invalid because they hadn't and Oppos. T notified the mineral rights holder, me. She'd built an entire neighborhood on a legal sinkhole, and I was holding the shovel. While Elias was drafting the counter lawsuit of the century, things at the valley took a dark turn. One night, around 2 a.m., my cameras alerted me to movement near the back of the cabin. 3 guys in dark hoodies were carrying gas cans and road flares, moving toward my woodpile. I didn't Oppos. T called the police first. I stepped onto the porch with my grandfather's old Winchester, not aiming at them, just letting the moonlight catch the barrel. I didn't Oppos. T say a word, just watch them. They froze, dropped the cans, and scrambled back toward the HOA road like their lives depended on it. I called the sheriff then, a guy named Martinez who was already tired of Victoria's constant complaints, and when he saw the gas cans and the camera footage of the attempted arson, the game officially changed from a property dispute to a criminal investigation. Martinez looked at me and said, see, you should know that the state attorney general's office has been looking into Victoria, Sterling, and Oppos, development and Oppos, companies. Turns out she's done this in 3 other states, using HOA fees to fund her lifestyle and then moving on before the law catches up. It was a classic, pump and dump, real estate scam. But she made one fatal mistake. She picked a fight with a guy who had nothing left to lose and a mountain of history to protect. 2 days later, the real fireworks started. I was sitting on my porch, enjoying a coffee that actually tasted like freedom, when a convoy of black SUVs and state police cruisers rolled up the mountain. It wasn't an Oppos, T for me. They went straight to Victoria's glass castle at the head of the valley. I watched through my binoculars as federal agents from the IRS and the FBI began hauling boxes of documents out of her house. It turns out, when my lawyer filed a notice of mineral rights conflict it triggered a massive audit of the development and oppos as financing, and they found that over $4 million in HOA fees had disappeared into shell companies Victoria owned in the Cayman Islands. But the most satisfying part? The mineral rights notification. Because the permits were technically illegal, the title insurance companies for all 8 mansions went into a total meltdown. Suddenly, these people who had looked down their noses at me were finding out their homes were legally unsellable and their property values had cratered to zero overnight. Victoria was led out of her house in handcuffs, still screaming about compliance and standards her blonde Bob Messi and her designer hiking boots finally getting some actual dirt on them as she was shoved into the back of a cruiser. The aftermath was like a slow, beautiful cleansing of the valley. Without Victoria's manipulation, the other homeowners, mostly regular people who had been bullied into following her lead, actually started talking to me. We found out that the Ridgeview Estate HOA was never a legal entity to begin with, and the court ordered a full dissolution of the association. I didn't exercise my mineral rights to dig up their lawns. I'm not a monster, but he used that leverage to ensure the entire valley was placed under a permanent conservation easement, so no one could ever build another glass box on my mountain again. Victoria ended up taking a plea deal for racketeering, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit arson, and she's currently serving a 12-year sentence in a federal facility where I'm guessing the architectural palette is strictly shades of gray. I'm back in my cabin now, with the power restored and the wildflowers blooming higher than ever. And sometimes, when the wind blows through the pines, I can almost hear my mother's laugh in the trees. It's funny, ISN and oppos, people like Victoria think that money and clipboards give them the right to erase history, but they forget that the ground beneath their feet has a memory of its own, and sometimes that memory has a way of rising up to bite you. I often wonder, though, what would have happened if I hadn't oppos. T had those mineral rights? What if I was just a regular guy without a century-old patent in his pocket? It makes you think about how many people out there are being bullied out of their homes right now by these suburban dictators who think they're above the law. Was I right to go nuclear on the whole neighborhood and oppos as property values to stop one woman, or was I just as ruthless as she was in my own way? I'd love to hear what you think. Have you ever had a run-in with an HOA that tried to take more than just your lawn ornaments? Drop a comment below and let me know if you think I crossed the line or if, mountain justice, was the only way to handle a queen who forgot she was standing on someone else in oppos. Mountain. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories about the little guy standing his ground. Because believe me, the world is full of Victorias, but it's also full of people like us who know exactly where the property line is. Case closed from the valley.